Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 6 of the preseason for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Utah Mammoth and lost by a score of 6-4. But before anything else, I do have to say that thankfully the preseason is finally coming to an end. 6 games is way too long. The NHL is at the very least changing it to just be 4 games starting next season, and we'll see how that one plays out. But 6 games, it just feels as though it goes on forever. But now we are going to get to the point where we're actually going to be playing some meaningful hockey games, which is going to be a really good change of pace here. Now, this game as a whole was very up and down, a roller coaster for sure. It starts off with actually an Adam Gaudette goal that gets the Sharks on the board early. A very nice individual play, kind of reminiscent, in fact, of the Barclay Goodrow Game 7 winner against the Vegas Golden Knights, the last time the Sharks were actually in the playoffs. A very similar style of goal, but that lead was very short-lived. Utah would not only tie this one up, but add 3 more after that to turn a 1-0 deficit for them into a 4-1 lead. The first period as a whole for the Sharks was really, really bad. The vast majority of the team looked quite awful in those first 20 minutes. But the second period came along and things turned around completely. San Jose looked fully rejuvenated, much better, and managed to actually tie that game up with goals from Tyler Toffoli after he managed a strong interception in the defensive zone, a goal from Barclay Goodrow off of a 2-on-1 with Gaudette, and then a goal from Will Smith receiving a beautiful pass from Macklin Celebrini on the power play. 4-1 game became 4-4 heading into the third period, but then Utah took back control right again. In fact, the third period was sort of similar to the first period, with the major difference being Askarov actually playing decently well, and so Utah only managed 2 goals in that final frame, enough, however, to claim this victory 6-4 here. Moving on to the players now, before I actually get into the individual play for these guys in this game, I do instead want to talk about the lineup that the Sharks actually went for tonight, and in particular the absences from the lineup here. Starting on the forward side, the notable one is definitely Michael Misa. However, this is an absence that does make a ton of sense. Of the first 5 preseason games, I believe Misa had played 4 of them, and so if he played tonight, that would be 5 of 6, which is a lot in the preseason, and especially this would have been the second half of a back-to-back. There's no reason to kind of overload the 18-year-old at this point before the season even begins, and so it makes a ton of sense that he sits this one out. I don't think this kind of jeopardizes his position in the starting lineup for the San Jose Sharks. That should still be the case, but not really much of a reason to get him into the lineup for this particular game. One absence, however, that did surprise me was actually Colin Graf not playing here tonight. I thought that Graf was a shoo-in to make it to the NHL lineup, and I do still believe that that will probably end up being the case. However, the fact that he doesn't play here tonight is certainly somewhat questionable. I would think final preseason game before the actual year begins, you would want to kind of get a bit of stability within your lineup, settle up some lines that you might actually have for game 1. Graf being there could have actually provided that, but him sitting out means you're going to have to work him in a little bit later. And then the other absence from the forward side is actually Pavel Regenda. Yesterday, he put up a all-timer performance, basically 4 assists in that one, putting up the best possible showcase for him to be able to try and make it onto this NHL roster. But unfortunately, the fact that he doesn't end up actually playing today, especially since his 2 line mates, both Cardwell and Ostapchuk, did draw into the lineup, makes me think that the Sharks don't really see him as an NHL option at this point. He'll likely end up getting sent down. He'll have to pass through waivers. Perhaps he doesn't get claimed and he ends up playing with the San Jose Barracuda, which would certainly be nice, but it wouldn't surprise me that significantly so if he did end up getting picked up. It just feels as though the Sharks are looking in a different direction, unfortunately, for Regenda. And then on the blue line, we do have a couple of players missing here tonight. No Dmitry Orlov, no John Klingberg. Both of these players will definitely be in the starting lineup for game 1 unless there is some sort of injury that exists for them. And just because they're the more veteran guys, they'll end up playing a good amount of minutes this season. The question, of course, is who steps out of the lineup at that point. For much of this preseason, I thought it would be Timothy Liljegren and Vincent Desharnais, but Liljegren has been making a pretty good case for himself. And on top of that, if you're removing 2 righties from your lineup and you're replacing it with a righty in Klingberg but a lefty in Orlov, it does make things a little bit more awkward. As much as Orlov can believe and the Sharks can believe that he can play that offside, we've already seen the disaster that can lead to. And even tonight, with both Liljegren and Desharnais playing, Mukhamadullin was forced onto his offside anyway. And so it's not exactly a perfect situation for the San Jose Sharks. We'll see which direction they decide to look in. It'll be some tough decisions on that blue line for game one. When it comes from more of an individual standpoint for the players in this game, starting off on that top line, obviously the big name player here is Celebrini, getting into the action for the first time in this preseason. He's had sort of a kind of weird nondescript injury / illness thus far. It sustained back on pretty much the first day of training camp. Then he missed a couple days, came back, hadn't really been participating with the main practice and training group, always doing kind of his own thing on the side. But the Sharks wanted to get him into a preseason game, help him get up to speed. He hasn't really played any real hockey since the World Championships a few months ago, and so it makes a ton of sense to try and ease him into it still. He plays here tonight. Not a good start in the first period, but literally nobody on the Sharks almost had a good start in that first period. But it did not take long for him to actually get warmed up, because by the time the second period rolled around, he was suddenly once again the Sharks' best player, just absolutely dominant in that middle frame, setting up great chances, winning battles as he usually does, basically doing everything that you expect from Macklin Celebrini. It didn't quite continue into the third period, but it was a good enough showing to really get him ready for that regular season when things actually do begin to matter a good bit more, entirely more, I should say. When it comes to his two line mates, then we have Will Smith. Smith's preseason as a whole actually hasn't been all that great. He's had some really high moments with some great playmaking abilities that he's shown off, but sort of in totality, his preseason hasn't been the best. However, being reunited with Celebrini here tonight, it certainly worked out a lot better. Both of these players managed to elevate each other's games to another level. Obviously, it helps getting placed with Celebrini. Any player is going to be able to look better in that case. It's just as if you get placed with Connor McDavid on a line with him with the Oilers, or getting placed with Sidney Crosby on a line with him with the Pittsburgh Penguins. Similar story here, but Smith, it is not just, as I said, Celebrini who helps out Smith, but Smith helps out Celebrini as well, that unspoken chemistry that they have between the two of them. And so Smith also looked extremely good in this middle frame, the second period of this game, and it bodes well heading into the actual regular season. And when it comes to Kurashev, the other player on this line, kind of serves as like a third wheel here at this point. It's definitely a tough position to be in when you are playing with Celebrini and Smith, because those two are always looking for each other. They're going to try for those crazy stretch passes 100 feet up the ice or through 3 different sticks to attempt to find each other. And so if you're that third player, you're just kind of trying to get into the right place at the right time. And because Celebrini and Smith always seem to be on the same page, getting onto that same level with those two is not an easy thing to do, and something that Kurashev couldn't quite accomplish here in this particular game. This is actually why that I'm hoping for some very real lineup stability, at least when it comes to this first line. You don't want just a rotating cast of players where at first it's Kurashev, and then it's Skinner, and then it's Toffoli, and then it's Eklund, and then it's Graf, and so on and so forth as you go through like 6-7 different wingers. You're never really going to be able to get a good combination if you continuously do that. So try to find someone early on in the season who can stick, and let him really ride it out with those two players so that they can actually all work as a trio instead of just having it be Celebrini and Smith featuring whoever is the winger of that particular night. When it comes to the Sharks' second line here, we have Eklund, Wenberg, and Toffoli. Definitely more of a veteran lineup, so to speak. It's kind of weird to say that about Eklund, who I believe only turns 23 in a few days from now. However, he is the longest tenured Sharks forward on this roster, and he's joined with Wenberg and Toffoli, who are two of the oldest forwards on this roster as well. And so provides some stability. However, here tonight, they didn't really get a ton done offensively. Obviously, Toffoli does manage to score, but besides that, it felt as though it was a very muted performance. Now, similarly, last game, yesterday against Vegas, we saw the second line do something pretty much along those same lines, but that was a combination of Dellandrea, Graf, and Lund. And when those three players are going up against an elite team in Vegas, you're actually kind of satisfied with the fact that not much happened offensively, but also they didn't give up much defensively. When your second line features Eklund and Toffoli, who are two of your best forwards, plus Wenberg, who is no slouch in this area himself, if it is a low event line, something feels as though it has gone wrong. And so you do expect more from this trio as a whole. This is, of course, the preseason, and it features both Wenberg and Toffoli, who are the two players on the San Jose Sharks who probably have the least to give in the preseason. So I'm not going to read too deeply into this sort of rougher performance from them, but it does maybe speak to the fact that the Sharks might want a little bit more of a dynamic look on this trio, which is why I am interested to see, once Michael Misa kind of finds his footing in the NHL, if we get that 70s line type of style setup with Eklund, Toffoli with Misa, because I think Misa could be that dynamic center who really sets things up well for those wingers. Wenberg just kind of, he's not a bad player by any means, but he slows the game down a little bit too much that it kind of doesn't get things rolling from an offensive perspective enough. And so tonight, these three players, it was relatively quiet. When it comes to the Sharks' third line here, as I already mentioned, Cardwell and Ostapchuk get a second game in a row. Definitely somewhat of a surprise, at least for Ostapchuk. Cardwell, it's not that crazy to see him here, but Ostapchuk, I guess they were looking for that center, so he does end up playing because he was not bad by any means in the previous game, but obviously paled in comparison to his two line mates, Cardwell and Regenda. And they are joined by Jeff Skinner, which I thought was an extremely odd inclusion onto this third line that didn't make a ton of sense, because the reason why it had so much success yesterday is because of the chemistry between not Cardwell and Ostapchuk, but Cardwell and Regenda, and that all three of those players were kind of those forecheck, hard-working type of guys. Regenda is someone who is winning battles, who is using his body to his advantage, 6'4", to be able to put himself into a good position to win the puck and get it to his teammates. Jeff Skinner is basically the polar opposite type of player, a smaller perimeter style of guy who's much more of a shooter. And so this was not really a third line that actually ended up working out, and I don't think that should have come as that much of a surprise. You had 2/3 of the recipe, but this is like if you're baking a cake and you decide to swap out the sugar with salt because you didn't have any sugar left. Like, obviously that's not going to come out well, and so this was kind of a strange combination to me. I felt maybe if they had gone Ostapchuk, Cardwell with Colin Graff, that would have likely looked a decent bit better, but I guess they wanted to get Skinner into the lineup here, or even someone like, I guess, Kurashev could have played with Ostapchuk and Cardwell. That probably still would have been a decent bit better. This third line just didn't quite work out here tonight. And then finally, we have the Sharks' fourth line, which, interestingly enough, I mentioned that most of the team was not particularly good at all in that first period. That came with the exception of these three players. The fourth line was the only halfway decent line in that first period. The standout was Adam Gaudette, I would say, but Ryan Reeves was actually still pretty good, and Goodrow, while slightly below the other two, actually ended up having a pretty solid game. Obviously, Goodrow was the talk of the town yesterday as a potential waiver wire option. It was never a very realistic chance that would happen. Coming into this preseason, it was like a 0.0001% chance of happening, and perhaps yesterday night it had bumped up to like a 1% chance, but it was never really in the cards. And definitely this performance that was above average from Goodrow likely stamps his spot on this team for the next 82 games of this season, unfortunately enough. But credit where credit is due, this fourth line did look rather well. I'm definitely very interested to see how Gaudette does progress throughout this season, because he clearly has like a really solid kind of offensive side to his game that might not really be able to find much success on the fourth line this season when playing with Goodrow and Reeves. Yes, they were able to support him decently well tonight, but it is still the preseason, and when the games do start to matter a little bit more and get a little bit tighter, I'm not sure those same openings are going to exist for these kind of slower, more veteran players. Gaudette, I definitely feel, is someone who will likely fill in the top 9 quite frequently for the Sharks. Misa is likely to make the team out of camp, but just as we saw with Will Smith near the beginning of last season, he's probably someone who will sit out some games here or there. And if he's playing, let's say, a third line center role, Gaudette to me is probably the guy who does get bumped up to take that third line center role while Misa sort of watches from the sidelines. So Gaudette definitely the kind of MVP of this trio, but still I want to give credit to Ryan Reaves, who had another solid game. The worry still begins again with the fact that this is preseason, so teams aren't pushing as significantly so, and so Reaves, who has the capability of being quite significantly exposed defensively, that quite hasn't happened just yet. Could easily end up playing out in the regular season, but right now it's been quite the promising start for him. And then Goodrow, as I said, he'll probably end up sticking around this year, as unfortunate as that may be. When it comes to the defensive side of things, we have the Sharks' top pairing. It is Liljegren featuring, once again, Nick Leddy. Somehow finds himself once more on the Sharks' top defensive pairing. And while the ice time was rather balanced throughout the lineup, all six of these players, the only one who didn't actually have around like 18 to 20 minutes was Desharnais, and that was because he got 4 minutes of penalties in this particular game. Otherwise, everyone was at around that same number. But while Dickinson led the way due to getting some significant offensive time near the end of this game, it was Leddy who was in second, the only other defenseman to eclipse 20 minutes here tonight. And it's just crazy to see that Nick Leddy, despite having a relatively below average training camp, has somehow worked his way into the good books of Ryan Warsofsky. And this is just so incredibly reminiscent of what happened last season with Barclay Goodrow. The Sharks picked up Goodrow off of waivers from the New York Rangers. Goodrow did not want to come to the San Jose Sharks. He did not want to be on the worst team in the entire league. And so because of that, I guess to make him feel better, the Sharks essentially coddled Goodrow and put him into positions to have immense success that he should have never found himself in multiple times within just the first couple of months of the season, where Goodrow was not only on the second line, but on the top line as well, getting shifts with players like Granlund, Toffoli, Smith, and Macklin Celebrini as well. And now it is playing out yet again with Nick Leddy. The Sharks pick him up off of waivers from the St. Louis Blues. He did not want to come to San Jose. It is the final year of his contract, perhaps his final contract in general in the entire NHL, and now he's having to spend it on a year with the San Jose Sharks. He's probably not particularly happy about that, and so in exchange, the Sharks are again coddling Nick Leddy by having him play these big minutes for the team. Leddy was a borderline NHL defenseman this past season with St. Louis. He was injured for a good chunk of the season. While he did play, I think, around 18 minutes, which is somewhat in line with what like a fourth defenseman would play in the playoffs when it really mattered for St. Louis. He was more of a bottom pairing player, and of course, he was put onto waivers because the Blues viewed him as rather expendable. So the fact that the Sharks are seeing him as like a top guy for them, though of course we'll see what happens once Orlov and Klingberg do rejoin the lineup. Perhaps Leddy will fall a little bit further down, but I don't really see a world for why he would be getting such significant ice time if that were truly going to end up being the case. Now, when it comes to his actual performance here tonight, Nick Leddy was not particularly good. His first period was awful, but then again, so was for pretty much every single player, so I won't put too much blame onto him for that. His second period did see somewhat of a rebound. He was actually rather solid in that second period, but then the third was not very good. And again, when it comes to who is played as your kind of top defenseman, it's just not good enough at this point for Nick Leddy, and yet from a Sharks perspective, it seems to be perfectly fine. His defensive partner, Timothy Liljegren, I actually thought had a pretty good game. He played yesterday in Vegas, where I thought he was maybe the Sharks' best defenseman. Here tonight, you could kind of keep him in a similar conversation. He definitely wasn't as good as he was yesterday, but it was still all right. Liljegren definitely trying to make his case to be able to make it into that top 6 group for the San Jose Sharks. Honestly, he has done a pretty good job of that. If life were fair, he would certainly be in that, let's say, third pairing defensive spot instead of a guy like Nick Leddy, but I don't think life is fair, and so that might not end up playing out, unfortunately for him. When it comes to the Sharks' second defensive pairing here, we have Dickinson with Desharnais. Now, I'll start off with Dickinson, who has surprised me and impressed me a ton thus far in this preseason. He's played multiple games already. He has usually been amongst like the top 2 or 3 defensemen, even at times being the best defenseman on the ice for the Sharks. That has been incredibly great to see, because there were worries for sure coming into this preseason about whether or not Dickinson was actually ready to make the jump to the NHL. And so a lot of really great things to be said about him. It is unfortunate, however, that his preseason does come to an end with this particular game, where Dickinson definitely had his worth showing by far. He looked really, really rough here tonight. It felt as though every single time he was stepping onto the ice, he was just making not necessarily a huge mistake, but a small mistake that you just don't want to see. And I think it really kind of spiraled in the beginning of the game, where obviously he was struggling in the first just as everybody else was. But Dickinson, it felt as though he kept trying to double down, where because he had made a few mistakes, now he felt as though he had to redeem himself by making a big play, and then that would cause him to just make another mistake, and it would snowball from there. And so this was just a rough game for Dickinson. He actually ended up hitting, I think, his highest ice time, surprisingly so, despite that, in this particular game, but one that he'll probably want to forget, though otherwise, as I said, the preseason has been very positive for him, and so definitely a spot in the NHL lineup should be there. When it comes to his defensive partner, Desharnais, he continues to be someone who kind of takes a bit too many penalties for sure. That's a bit of a deficit, and considering two defensemen are going to have to sitting on the sidelines here, it is very likely at this point that Desharnais is one of them. This was not necessarily an awful game. I do think he was kind of dragged down a little bit by Dickinson not playing particularly well here tonight, but unfortunately, for Desharnais, he didn't have the positive impact that Dickinson did previously in this preseason, so he doesn't have that goodwill to actually be able to get that lineup spot anyway. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, we have Ferraro and Mukhamadullin. As I said, Mukhamadullin having to play on his offside, and he has probably been like the unluckiest player in this preseason thus far, because for all intents and purposes, Mukhamadullin has actually been quite good throughout the games that he has played, somewhat up and down, but has managed to maintain a decent amount of stability, and honestly has outperformed a lot of the more veteran guys like Orlov and Klingberg and Leddy and Ferraro throughout this preseason thus far. But the reason I say he has been unlucky is that in multiple games that he has played thus far, his defensive partner has just been an absolute disaster and have just dragged him down completely. You go back a few days ago and it was Dmitry Orlov who had like one of the worst games ever, and as such it made Mukhamadullin look a good bit worse despite actually playing decently well. And here tonight the same thing does play out. While Ferraro is a far cry from where Orlov was in that other game, Ferraro was not good here tonight either. Obviously the rough first period, but it didn't actually get much better in the second, as Ferraro was just kind of doing a lot of the same things that we saw from Dickinson here tonight, making mistakes and then trying to overcompensate for them, and as such leading to even more mistakes. And so again, Mukhamadullin dragged down by a weaker defensive partner here, as Ferraro was just trying to do too much quite consistently throughout. I don't think his spot in the lineup is in jeopardy like at all, but perhaps the Sharks said it was, and that's why Ferraro was trying to do that too much in this game, but it was not a pretty look for him. Mukhamadullin, though, I thought still had a good game, even if it might not look great on paper. And then finally we have the Sharks goaltender Yaroslav Askarov. This was a pretty important game. I floated the idea yesterday that there was a chance that Nedeljkovic could end up getting the start for game one of the regular season, because he has been absolutely lights out in this preseason, while Askarov had just been kind of okay. But I imagine it would be in the Sharks' best interest to try and get Askarov in for that first game, and so it was likely going to come down to his performance here tonight. Had he won this game, even if it was like letting in 3 goals, like the Sharks won 5-3, I would have bet money on Askarov starting that game. But with this loss and the fact that he lets in 6 goals, it's hard to imagine a world where Nedeljkovic does not get the start in game one. And this was just generally a rough game for Askarov. Sometimes you can look at a team that gave up 6 goals and say, well, the defense just did him 0 favors. But honestly, 2 or 3 of these goals were ones that Askarov probably could have had, or at least made a better play on. The issue with Askarov throughout tonight was actually not in close, where usually a lot of goaltenders run into trouble with these high danger opportunities just a few feet from the crease. Askarov did a very good job of tracking those types of chances, but it was the ones from far out, from 40, 50 feet from the blue line in the offensive zone, that Utah was able to burn him. When they would get some traffic in front, 2-3 players, Askarov had extreme difficulty actually tracking the puck, and that led to 2 or 3 of these goals actually managing to get by him. There was also the issue with rebound control, which is something that I highlighted a few times last season as a weakness of Askarov's game, that his rebound control wasn't necessarily the best, and I was hoping that that would get addressed throughout this offseason and he would be able to come back stronger in that area. Here tonight, however, we saw the cracks come out yet again. On that Agazino goal, it stems from a pretty big rebound from Askarov, and then there were multiple other moments that thankfully the team was able to clean up, but that still stood out as potential dangerous opportunities. And the thing is with goaltenders, is that if they are good at controlling rebounds, you don't even really notice that it is even a thing. But when they are bad at controlling rebounds, it really does stand out. And while I don't think Askarov is bad necessarily, he does need to work on this particular aspect of the game because it does look really, really rough when it does happen. And so, as I said, it is likely that Nedeljkovic does play that first game. Askarov is still certainly in that kind of 1A, 1B type of situation. It is still very possible we see a similar situation as played out in Calgary with Dustin Wolf and Dan Vladar last year, where in the first half of the season, Vladar, I think, played like 21 games and Wolf played 20, so pretty much an even split. And in the final 41 games, Wolf played like 30 of them because he had taken over as the starter. The hope here is that a similar thing could happen with Askarov and Nedeljkovic. We'll see, but you want to go and ride the hot hand, and right now that is definitely Nedeljkovic. So if you want to have that potential strong start to a season, Nedeljkovic is likely that guy. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday. Finally, game 1 of the regular season. It is Vegas yet again. The Sharks played the Golden Knights 3 times through the preseason, but now it actually does matter. Now it really has kind of upped the stakes, no pun intended, with Las Vegas. And Vegas are definitely going to bring their A game. I already mentioned yesterday that they are a prediction for the best team in the Western Conference this season, and many people might be predicting that the Sharks are going to be the worst team in the Western Conference, so going to be quite the challenge. Class dismissed.